Okay, it's 9:30, so I'm going to start, and I'm going to start by muting y'all, if I remember how to do that.
Lower left corner, Gaines.
Oh yeah, there's a mute on. Okay, and I think I may go to, don't we go to just me? How do I do that? I forgot already.
If you want to see just yourself, go to speaker view.
Man, I can't find speaker view. That's what's worrying me. Is that on the participant link?
No, it's on the upper right.
Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. Thanks.
But Gaines, if you what your choice of speaker view or not doesn't affect anybody else.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Y'all still get, oh, okay. Well, you're on your own. You
Yeah.
choose to look at me or
Right.
look at each other.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, you can mute us.
I have about twice as much to say today as I have time to say it. So if I talk really fast, you understand why. Last time, you remember, we talked about, and really all three of the first three times we've talked about, this fundamental division over memory, that Americans are still fundamentally divided over the meaning of the Civil War, particularly over the role of slavery in the Civil War. It depends in part on how you ask the question. It depends in part on who you ask. And that's now been magnified in this current debate over Confederate monuments and Confederate symbolism. And so that's what we've been looking at. And again, what I tried to suggest to you last week is that so incredibly important, because if you look at recent developments, there's still a racial divide. There's still a bit of a regional divide. But the most fundamental divide is over partisanship, Republican versus Democrat, and over rural versus urban. And that it's now been sort of folded into a larger debate about the nature of America and the nature of race in the present as much as in the future. But I also try to suggest to you that I think in part there is a tendency to say, consciously or unconsciously, let's deny this history, because if we deny this history, it eliminates the demand for any action in the present and the future to address systemic racism and racial problems in general. And I think that's why this debate over Confederate and Civil War memories becomes so important. So today what I want to do is shift from memory, which we talked about for the first 3 weeks, to history, and to actually look at the past. And I primarily want to focus on sort of evaluating the lost cause division of history. So we're going to look at the nature of slavery. In other words, the lost cause begins with the assumption that the war really isn't about slavery, it's states' rights. So I want to look at that. I want to look at the causes of the war. But it also then says, okay, not only was the war not about slavery, slavery was a benign institution, and we have this celebration in the Old South, and I want to look briefly at slavery without getting into too much detail there, because I want to move fast. The South also talks about being defeated by overwhelming numbers, and just for the historical record, I want to at least address that. They talk about the evils of Reconstruction, and I want to very quickly do the evils of Reconstruction. But as I said, there's also this tendency in the South, not only to talk about their sort of virtual victoriousness, but also their vindication, but their victimization. And particularly because this came up in one of the early questions, I think actually the first week, I want to look at the post-war Southern economy and the role of the Civil War played in that. But I also want to look at that because as we try to understand the various forms white supremacy has taken, the role of the image of African Americans as inherently criminal is central to that. And that very much is part of the story of the post-war South. So that's kind of where we're going today. So the question then becomes, if you want to talk about race in America, where do you start? And since Linda asked about it, I'll briefly say, lately, because of the 1619 Project from the New York Times, everybody wants to start in 1619. And the 1619 Project was challenged by a number of historians who I respect greatly, but the Pulitzer Prize Committee gave it New York. I gave it a Pulitzer Prize and said, yeah, historians go play in the traffic. And historians may change their mind now that Trump has decided to attack the 1619 Project. But it's pushed a metaphor that makes me somewhat nervous, and that is it pushes the notion that racism is part of America's DNA. And again, the whole DNA analogy, I think, is tricky when you talk about race, because we're trying to remind everybody that race and DNA are not related. But I agree that white racism has been a constant in American history. And it has waxed and waned based on how strong a counterforce exists to challenge it. And that counterforce has often and primarily come from the African American community. But it's succeeded at those points in which it has had white support, and most importantly, in my mind, white political support. Now, we're not going to trace that history, but it's worth thinking about, and I'll mention at least one example of that today. So you could start in 1619 with the arrival of the first Africans, but I want to go back a step further. Most people who talk about white racism nowadays tie it to the emergence of the international slave trade. And there's no question that the slave trade and racism are interrelated. But the really scary thing for me is the black image in the white mind predates that. And I would argue makes slavery in America, African slavery in America, possible. And that goes back even to the first contact between Englishmen and Africans. And they go over to Africa and they immediately interpret Africans as black. And so this notion of blackness arises from the very beginning. And they even offer explanations from it. And it so happens in the history of white racism, it gets intermingled with religion. So that one of the explanations for the blackness of Africans that has absolutely no historical reality or biblical reality is the curse of Ham in Genesis, which becomes a long explanation for racism in American society and race itself. And when they pick the phrase black, it then raises within the English minds all sorts of color-coded associations. So that the English already thought of black as evil, darkness as dangerous. So that the very notion of blackness associates black people with evil. The fact that they meet them first in Africa and they don't have on many clothes by English standards and they don't worship English gods convinces them that Africans are uncivilized and savage and heathen. And again, that will turn into the savagery, into criminality as time goes on. To pick up that theme, I want to pick up more next time. And finally, they meet Africans and the big apes at the same time in Africa. And so very quickly, this notion of blacks related and resembling apes is a strong trope within the American mind and with the English mind, even before slavery. Now, I'm sure you remember during Obama's presidency, there were memes and posts and examples of people comparing President Obama to an ape. So here you have this notion of blackness that has survived for over 500 years within the American mind, which I think is a frightening notion of how central all of this is and how necessary it is for us to understand and to confront it. So 1619, you have the first Africans. It's not even clear that all of them are treated as slaves. By 1660, Virginia has legalized slavery. You begin to have the creation of slave society in Virginia. You begin the massive importation of Africans, and much of the rest of the South does the same thing. So that by 1713, South Carolina actually has a black majority. There are more Africans in colonial South Carolina than they are English people or anybody else. Remember too, at this stage, slavery exists everywhere. Every American colony has slavery. New England, middle colonies, the South. The numbers are much higher in the South for various reasons. But we tend to forget that slavery up until the Revolution is not a sectional, but a national institution, something particularly Northerners tend to forget, though in the last 10 years, New York especially has worked hard at confronting that heritage. So you have slavery. So beyond that, then you have the revolutionary generation. I'm moving really fast now, for which I apologize. And the revolutionary generation sectionalizes slavery. In other words, they passed the Northwest Ordinance that keeps slavery out of the territory north of the Ohio River. They, in most of the northern and middle colonies, they abolish slavery because they see the inconsistency between celebrations of liberty and holding people as slaves. Though again, in places like New Jersey and New York, where the slave population is about 10%, it's a gradual process of emancipation. So in some, I think it's New Jersey, you still have 10 people who were slaves in 1850, but they have a different name than slaves because they don't want to admit that. Most of them were freed only at age 25, and if you were a slave when the law was passed, you remained a slave. So in any case, but you do sectionalize slavery. But on the other hand, as I assume you know, the Constitution recognizes slavery in various ways, various clauses of the Constitution. They very cleverly never use the word slave, but it recognizes. So having said that, what I want to really focus on first is the centrality of slavery to the development of America. Again, we talk about structural racism all the time. Historically, that's easy to document. So let's talk briefly about the centrality of slavery. First of all, the slavery is so essential to westward expansion. So if you look at the southern part of the United States, it's settled and opened up as land for slavery. Even Indian removal, of our two great original sins, the treatment of the Native Americans and the slaves, they become interrelated at this point because Indian removal sets off a process of providing territory in the Southeast for the expansion of slavery. I think that story is important for all kinds of reasons. One is the three great myths of American history are the Civil War, the American Revolution, and westward expansion. And if I talk about westward expansion, if I talk about frontiersmen, I'm willing any of you hearing that your images of Davy Crockett or a white guy. In the southeastern part of the United States, the frontiersmen were enslaved Africans who cleared the land and expanded the economy. We don't tend to remember that. Secondly, our image of the Old South, like especially to Gone with the Wind, I'll go back to the land. Our notion of Southerners is their ties to the land. Well, in the antebellum South, as one economic historian has put it quite succinctly, Southern planters were landlords, were labor lords, not landlords. In other words, slavery was a means of economic expansion, not tied to the land. You'd wear the land out and you'd move west. And I think that's important to remember. Secondly, along with westward expansion, it's central to that. Slavery is central to American economic development. And listen to how I said that, not Southern economic development, American economic development. In the early days of the colonial period, it was the trade with the West Indies to feed their slaves that generated economic growth in New England. And up until 1808, when the United States stopped it, much of early New England's wealth was also based on the trade in slaves themselves. But even after that, one of the things that historians are stressing so much these days are the importance of slavery to the development of international capitalism. And particularly in the North, industrial development and the expansion of American capitalism is tied to the first of the great industries in the North, which is the cotton textile industry, which is driven by forced slave labor in the South. And so it has a tremendous role in American industrialization and economic development. The other thing that we know now that we didn't pay much attention to for a very long time, and that is slaves themselves, the enslaved people themselves, become a source of capital for economic development. In other words, they become a source of collateral for loans. that finance a great deal of economic development across the country. So slavery is essential, plays an essential role, not essential too, but plays an essential role in the development of America's national economic growth, not just its South. But having said that, again, slavery is for the most part a sexual institution. And when you look at the South, slavery is absolutely central to Southern society. It is a slave society, not a society with slaves. And slavery shapes the South's values and culture in very fundamental ways. It's absolutely intertwined with the whole development. So it's a society totally committed to slavery, but also a society very much shaped by slavery. And you can see that in various ways. Remember too that slavery is a system of economic exploitation and racial control. Economic exploitation and racial control. You got to remember both to understand the way slavery operates within Southern society. Now that leads us to the issue of treatment, and I don't want to go into a whole long discussion of the nature of slavery and how it's treated, how slaves are treated. But again, that's part of it. Remember the image that you have in the lost cause, and really in the American plantation tourist industry and in much of American popular culture, is of a very benign institution. Slavery is a very complex institution, and the treatment of slaves are more complex. The last 10 years, the historiography, the historians who are writing about slavery tend to talk about its brutality, which is easy to do and absolutely essential to do. For the 10 or 15 years before that, there was a great deal of discussion about how slaveholders, enslavers were using incentives to maximize slave labor. You would rent a slave out, but you would allow them to keep a percentage of their wealth. You would allow slaves to grow gardens on their off time and sell that produce and make money. In other words, there are various ways that you could do that. So both of that is true, and I actually think the incentives are important. But remember, to control and exploit requires discipline. And so at the heart of slavery is discipline. And at the heart of that discipline was the lash. And when we've done quantitative studies, what we find is on most plantations, somewhere between 1 to 3 days, once every 3 to 4 days, an enslaved person was beaten, usually in front of the other enslaved people to make a point. In other plantations, the brutality was even worse. And one of the real evils of slavery is if you have a sadistic master or overseer, it's a system that virtually gives them free rein for their sadism. It is also marked by incredible degrees of rape and sexual molestation, particularly by the planters' sons and the overseers. And so that's part of the system as well. So there's no point in trying to make it a benign institution. At its best, it's a brutal institution. But as I tell my students, what's the purpose of slavery? There's a sociologist who did a comparative study of slavery. And he said the goal of slavery is social death. In other words, the goal of slavery is to take a human being and make them not human. Now, if you understand that that's slavery's goal, then even treatment becomes almost irrelevant. It is a brutal institution that's trying to take humanity even at its best. But it was rarely at its best. It is an exploitive institution. One of the historians who's stressing the brutality has come up with a phrase that I'm quite taken with and embarrassed that I never used for so long. And he says, why call it a plantation? It is a slave labor camp. And if you think in those terms, think about that. There's a tremendous industry in the celebration of plantations. One of the things they make money off of is weddings. Think about changing the name. Thinking about a wedding invitation that goes to all your friends that says, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so invites you to the wedding of their daughter at the Nottoway slave labor camp. Just the way we think about it and the way we talk about it changes our image. But the centrality to slavery in Southern society is important. It's important economically. It's important also in the way it shapes politics. If our former member Bill Cooper were here, he would remind you that if you look at the early political process in the South between the Whigs and the Democrats, the great second party system of the antebellum period, the major form of political confrontation in the South was which party could best protect slavery. If you look at political values, Americans said the same words about politics and about the nature of America that Northerners did. But when Southern whites talked about liberty, one of their major definitions of liberty was the liberty to own slaves. Southern whites believed in free speech unless that speech threatened slavery. So in the 1830s, when abolitionists mailed petitions to the South against slavery, mobs in Charleston burned them with the help of the postman. Even in religion, in other words, evangelical Protestantism in the South becomes pro-slavery. And I would go a step further, and I'm increasingly convinced that the whole tendency within American culture, and particularly in Southern culture, for a conservative literal interpretation of scripture rests in the need to defend slavery, and that's where that view of the scripture that still persists in American society today comes from. So you've got a society totally committed to and totally shaped by slavery. Now, one of the arguments that the defenders of the lost cause continue to make is to say, well, the war can't be about slavery because most whites in the South didn't own slaves, which is true. The number suggests probably no higher than 1 in 3 white Southerners even was a member of a family that owned slaves. But they too are committed to slavery. First of all, even if you don't own slaves, you aspire to own slaves. Secondly, many people who didn't own slaves are still economically involved in the system. Part of that is the hiring out system. If you wanted to clear your land to start a new farm, you could hire a slave for a year. In other words, even if you didn't own slaves, you could hire slaves. We've already talked about the role of slaves in the maintenance of bank credit. For the professionals like lawyers and doctors, slave masters were their main source of income. So everybody is economically involved in slavery. And third, and most importantly, it is a system of racial control. So if you're a poor white, slavery is the means to control black people who you see as savage and uncivilized. Moreover, it's a means to social status. In the South, the line became between slave and free. And if you were free and not a slave, you were considered equal. So slavery as a system of racial control and as a system of social status for poor whites means that large numbers of Southerners who don't own slaves still support the system. So let's look, second topic I want to talk about today, the Civil War itself. And I want to look first very briefly at the causes leading up to the Civil War. And the causes were various that the sections fought over, but the two most important was slavery in the territories. In other words, in the coming of the war, the fight is not about slavery itself, but slavery in the territories. Southerners saw the expansion of slavery into the West, places like New Mexico and Utah and Nebraska and all these unsettled places in the West, as absolutely essential. They also saw expansion important because they were thinking not just West, but South into the Caribbean potential. But they believe economically they have to spread slavery. And it's particularly true of the younger sons of planters who become some of the most ardent secessionists. They also think that they need to expand slavery because they're scared of black people. This fear of black revolt is very real in the South. And they believe that if the population of the enslaved grows too long, the threat of revolt grows. And so if you keep spreading the African population west, it'll reduce the percentages and make the world safer. They also see it as a point of honor. If the federal government can say, you can't take your slave to Nebraska, like anybody would want to take their slave to Nebraska, that's saying there's something wrong with you. And so any attack on slavery was also an attack in the white South's mind on their honor. So slavery in the territories is a big issue. Why does the North care? In part because it's the future of America. In part because some people, like Abraham Lincoln and others, saw if you stopped the expansion of slavery, if you contained it where it was, it would eventually die. But they also, many of them, believe in a free labor economy. In other words, they believe an economy based on everybody owning their own labor and being able to sell it in the marketplace, raise enough money to become an independent farmer, an independent shopkeeper, is the kind of society you wanted. And they saw that as incompatible with slavery. So that if you had slaves in the territory and you had this free labor economy in the territory, the slave labor would have an unfair advantage. I mean, the slave owner would have an unfair advantage. So they don't want slavery in the territory. And some of them don't want slavery in the territories because they're afraid if you have slavery in the territories, someday they'll be free and there'll be free black people. So that slavery in the territories for some Northerners was a keep it out because we want to keep blacks in. Again, the North is never free from the racism that deeply shakes the South. So they fight over slavery in the territories. They also fight over fugitive slave laws. The Constitution required Northern states to return fugitive slaves. Increasingly, as Northerners are appalled by slavery, some of them, they will fight to prevent the return of a runaway slave to the South. Some of those states even pass laws that say you don't have to obey the federal law telling you to do that. And Southerners deeply resented that. Now that's fascinating because again, what's the South's justification for slavery and the lost cause? It's about states' rights. Northern states were trying to say, we have the right to defy the federal government to prevent the return of fugitive slaves. And the South says, no, you don't. The Constitution overrides that. So here on an issue where states' rights would have pointed them in one direction, slavery points them in a different direction. So those issues create increasing conflict. Okay, now I'm going to try to give you maps. So you can listen and maps. So in part because of that tension, by the election of 1860, the political parties have disintegrated. And some people argue one of the major causes of the Civil War is that. And so by the election of 1860, you have really two separate elections, with the Republican running against the Democrat in the North, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas, and in the South, you have a separate Democratic Party, the Southern Democratic Party, Douglas, Breckinridge running against Bell. You don't have, as I would tell my students for the test, you don't have to know the names. What's interesting is, what's important is, Lincoln wins. What's interesting is Lincoln wins with 40% of the vote. Lincoln is a minority president. But you see in the map by 1860 a division. That will lead
Gaines, we can't hear you.
No.
Is it working now?
There we
Huh?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, you don't get the screen back. We'll try it again in a minute. So anyway, Lincoln gets elected. And that sets off a lower South secession that we need to understand. They then try to find some sort of means to compromise. And all attempts at compromise fail, primarily over the issue of slavery in the territories. The South is adamant that all territories be open to slavery. Lincoln and the Republican Party has built its whole political future on no slavery in the territories, what was called free soil. And he will not compromise on that issue. So it's very difficult to find any kind of compromise. Interestingly enough, Lincoln supports and Congress passes what some historians jokingly call the first 13th Amendment, which is a guarantee that slavery will continue to exist. A constitutional guarantee. South won't buy that either. The white South is absolutely convinced that Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party pose a threat to slavery, if not now, eventually. And so they secede to preserve slavery. If you don't believe me, Google Southern secessionist documents, and you can find a host of them, which list all kinds of reasons. They're designed to sound like the Declaration of Independence, and they list the grievances. Major grievances are slavery in the territories, Fugitive Slave Act, or the enforcement. But let me read you one of them, in case you don't believe me. And this is Mississippi. And it says, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies and product produce, which constitutes by far the largest and most important portion of commerce on the earth. The products are, and on and on. And in every one of these documents, you'll find slavery at the heart of the war. Southern states that seceded then sent representatives to other states to try to convince them to secede. And those documents, I've got a book, I'll send you a reference if you want it, where it prints several of them, are amazing in terms of how open they are about slavery. And how much, even more than some of the secessionist declarations by the conventions, even more than them, tie it not just to slavery, but to white supremacy. And are absolutely unapologetic. If you don't secede, you'll have a Republican president who will lead to an end to slavery and eventually the black rule. And Lincoln is known as a black Republican, despite the fact that Lincoln is very much a moderate and at this point in his top life, very much a racist. So that anybody looking at what the South does when it secedes, what the South says when it secedes, what it writes down for posterity and God and everybody else, it's slavery. So if you understand secession, you have to start with slavery. And the fact that with all of that evidence there, and people simply ignoring it, makes it seem to me that our historical interpretation is, or of the lost cause, is willful. And it is fascinating to watch people like Jefferson Davis, who before the war makes no bones it's about slavery, and after the war writes an 800-page book saying it's not, which is absolutely common. Now, the interesting question that makes life a little more complicated is how they justify it. In other words, why do you have the right to secede? Robert E. Lee said you don't, but you have the right of revolution. And we're doing what they did in the Declaration of Independence. Some argued for popular sovereignty, that people have the right to decide for themselves, and secession happened on the basis of popular sovereignty. Most argued that the Constitution allowed secession. It was a matter of having agreed to join the Union. A state has a right to revoke that agreement and declare its renewed independence. And one of the reasons they love to talk about the Fugitive Slave Act is they say, see, there was this contract that the Constitution represented, and the North has violated it by not upholding the federal Constitution on the Fugitive Slave Act, so we have the right to secede. Now, the really interesting question is whether or not they had the right to secede. There's a very famous historian, now long, well, not long dead, but dead, who was very much an anti-slavery historian. He wrote one of the great early attacks on the institution of slavery. And he read the Constitution, and he read the debates, and he read the ratifying debates, and he says, there ain't no answer to that question, whether or not secession was legal. Now, the other equally interesting question that one of y'all asked, I think by email earlier, is, okay, the South secedes, why didn't the North 11 go? Well, there are several reasons for that. One is increasingly over time in the antebellum period, the North becomes more nationalistic. They have begun to believe in a perpetual union, that the Union was designed to last forever and that there was no right of secession. Lincoln makes a case, and I think it's one of the strongest cases against the South, and that is, if you break up the Union because you lost an election, how can democracy survive? And so in Lincoln's mind, if you allowed secession, you undermine democracy, not only in America, but for the world. But the other key is Lincoln very cleverly maneuvers the South into firing on Fort Sumter. I had pictures, but you can go through life without those, I'm nervous. So the South fires on Fort Sumter. What Lincoln says is, Fort Sumter's running out of food. Lincoln says, I won't rearm it, but let me send it food. And they said, nope, they fired on it. Dumbest thing the South ever did. That really changes the debate, because that is an attack on the flag. That is an attack on law and order. And so the North, it's after Fort Sumter, Lincoln calls for troops, the North marches off to war. So in the early stages of the Civil War, the North fights to preserve the Union. And as you remember in our discussion of Northern memory, that will always remain the primary memory of the North. Within 2 years, Lincoln announces the Emancipation Proclamation. In part as a war remained, in other words, he realizes the importance of slavery to the South, and therefore understands that if he eliminates slavery, he threatens the South. And he will include in that the recruitment of black troops. But the Emancipation Proclamation, which doesn't legally do much of anything because it only applies to the South where Lincoln has no influence, makes the war about slavery. And for the North, it revives the war effort. It makes the cause Union and slavery and gives it a nobility it didn't have before, which fosters Northern morale. Unfortunately, it fosters Southern morale as well, because it's their worst nightmare come true. And so the support for the Confederacy grows because they realize that what the war is about is also slavery. And again, for them, it's always about slavery. So again, at the heart of the Civil War is the institution of slavery. What the South was trying to do, what the Confederacy was all about, was to create an independent slaveholding republic. And the North, at first, is fighting only to prevent the independence. But very quickly, it becomes a war to end slavery as well. But again, if you start with secession, the war's about slavery. And again, the denial of that has to be almost willful. And I think for the South, it is willful. Okay. I'm so used to lecturing, I'm about to say, any questions, but you're all muted, so you have to wait. Okay, I'm even further behind. Let me at least, because I talk so much about the lost cause, I want to raise the question of why the South loses. And like everything else, there's no agreement among historians. You can make a case for internal dissent costing the South the war. In other words, that particularly internal dissent by women or internal dissent by the poor people. And there are bread riots. There are a lot of a lot of unhappiness in the Confederate South. That undermined the South. Certainly the internal descent of the slaves, the enslaved who stopped working and run away and do other things in the midst of the war, plays a role. Others, not unlike the Lost Cause, stress the overwhelming numbers and resources of the North. And I actually lean that way myself. I think the case that the South was able to keep an army in the field for 4 years against the North was a fairly amazing military accomplishment. And so I do think in many ways it's the overwhelming numbers and resources. One part of the overwhelming numbers, though, doesn't get the emphasis it should in many quarters. There's a great case to be made that the recruitment of African American soldiers, which followed the Emancipation Proclamation, and the 200,000 African American soldiers who fought in the war, provided the northern margin of victory. In other words, both their role and the role of internal dissent, with slaves refusing to work in the fields and sabotaging production and running away and all of that made African Americans, and particularly African American soldiers, central to northern victory. So that aspect of the African American memory of the Civil War, seems to me, is absolutely justifiable. So what happens after the war? Let me go really fast here if I can. One of, again, this Southern sense of victimization. Let me try the slides again. I'm curious if I can make these work. I wanted you to see these. So can you still hear me? One of the other things to remember that I didn't mention, remember too, you've got these 4 states, Missouri, Kentucky, Virginia, later West Virginia, Delaware. They still had slavery even in the Union, which is another reason to not see the war necessarily as there's Fort Sumter. Never mind. I don't want to be in these. Charleston. Okay. So what about Reconstruction? One of the most important things to remember about Reconstruction is it comes in 2 stages. The first stage, they leave ending the war and creating new Southern society to white conservatives, the same people who ruled the South since the Revolution. And they screw it up. They don't give blacks the vote. There's tremendous amount of violence, particularly in Louisiana and in New Orleans and Memphis, Tennessee, massacring of blacks. And that forces the North to move in second stage of Reconstruction, where you try to reconstruct the nation based on a political solution which includes or really rests on African American suffrage. So when you talk about Reconstruction, it's not this period of horrendous awfulness. It is one of the most hopeful periods in American race relations in American history. Because what the North does is create in the South for somewhere between 2 to 8 years, depending on which state you're talking about, a successful biracial democracy. And so you have a biracial democracy that runs the South. There is corruption. There is an increase in taxes. There's all those problems. Same things going on in the North. But they create schools. They build railroads. They foster economic development. They provide some of the best first public services in the South. They write constitutions that are better than most Southern constitutions, again, will be again until the late 20th century. And so Reconstruction is really an example of how, if you combine African-American pressure, because blacks were essential to pushing Lincoln and others toward African-American suffrage, with white political power, you can create racial change. The best history of Reconstruction these days calls it an unfinished revolution. In other words, it really was an attempt to create a better American society that for a time worked. It failed in part because the North loses interest. In other words, for Reconstruction to work, you had to have a sort of constant military presence that the North wasn't willing to do. And the North, because of economic recession in 1873 and other reasons, begins to lose interest in Southern Reconstruction, so you don't have Northern support. It loses interest because blacks have political power but not economic power, something we'll talk about later. But it ends primarily because uniting within the Democratic Party, whites unite around white supremacy. And so what they convince whites is, if you want white supremacy, you have to vote for us. And in states with large white majorities, that alone led to the Democratic Party and whites retaking control. In states like Mississippi and South Carolina and Louisiana, where you have a large African-American population, what they do is resort to terrorism. So Reconstruction ends primarily because of white terrorism. No place worse than Louisiana, in which you have major massacres of black people in New Orleans and in Colfax, in New Orleans twice, and many other blacks killed. The number of African Americans killed to preserve white supremacy or reestablish white supremacy in Reconstruction numbers in the thousands. And it's really that ends Reconstruction. It doesn't close down the system. And in fact, some historians are now talking about a long Reconstruction and say it doesn't end in 1876 when the federal troops pull out. It ends in 1890, but we'll go to that next time. Let me see if I can do quickly what the post-war story, because I think it's really important, and maybe it'll be good doing. Again, one of the aspects of the lost cause, I do want to try to show the slides this time. Let's see if this is going to work. One of the aspects of the lost cause that's so important to most people is this notion. Okay. No. Well, now you're going to get the slides. I've got recorded over slides that I didn't mean to. Okay, so you just get to hear. Okay, so what about this notion of the destructiveness of the Civil War? Remember, at the heart of the lost causes is victimization. That the reason we're poor is because of what the North did in the war. Now, let's start with what could have happened. This is one of the great places where you can talk about counterfactual history. At the end of the war, what could have happened? You could have executed a tremendous number of Southerners for treason. They execute and hang a guy named Wirtz, who was head of the Andersonville prison. They execute 4 people who were involved in the assassination of Lincoln. Other than that, none. Really interesting, during the Civil War, there's an Indian rebellion in Minnesota. They put that down and they hanged 39 Indians at one time for treason. You see some of the difference. Davis, Lee, and others are arrested and charged with treason. Davis actually spends a fair amount of time in prison, which only makes him a hero in the South before the North drops the charge. Really, by 1870, almost every Confederate leader except 5 or 6 have received their property back. They've received the vote. They received their citizenship. So there's really no overwhelming public punishment of by the North of Southern. The other thing that can happen, and one of the most amazing stories of Reconstruction, you've got 4 million enslaved people who have been brutalized by the system of slavery. The fact that in the midst of the Civil War or at the end of the Civil War, you could have had a slave revolt with massive African-American violence is absolutely understandable. And white Southerners were deeply afraid of it. It made sense. Doesn't happen. I think there are 2 major reasons for that. One is African-American Christianity, which taught them part of the morality was the discipline. And second, an amazing faith based on little evidence of African Americans within the ideals of American civilization and politics. So when you talk about the destructiveness of the war, you don't have a slave revolt. You don't have the massive incarceration or murder, hanging of Southerners. The pictures I was trying to show you are the pictures most people have of these destroyed cities: Atlanta, Columbia, Richmond, Charleston. They're still in textbooks. Atlanta and Charleston, Atlanta's burned by Sherman. Charleston really is destroyed by shelling of Northern Union Navy. Columbia, we're still fighting over who burned it, but the South helped by putting all the cotton bales in the middle and setting them on fire. And Richmond is actually burned by retreating Confederates, losing control of the warehouses they burned. So again, we've overestimated the destruction of the war. We've underestimated. One of the things that's left out of the lost cause is that the South probably would have done the same thing if it had been more successful militarily. Jubal Early burns Chambersburg. There's a plot and a successful burning in St. Albans, Vermont. And in New York City, there was a plot to burn it. And even more importantly in understanding the brutality of the Southern side of the war is the massacre of Black troops at Fort Pillow, at the Battle of the Crater in Petersburg, at Ebenezer Creek during Sherman's March to the Sea, at Fort Plymouth in North Carolina. You have Confederate soldiers literally massacring Black troops. So again, this notion of the sort of savage North and civilized Southern armies is overrated. Most importantly, we have overestimated the destructiveness of the Civil War on the Southern landscape and economy. I got suspicious early on when I would do tours in Georgia. And by the time I went to the 8th or 10th house, which was the only house Sherman spared, I got suspicious. Our colleague, Paul Pascal, has published a brilliant article that actually quantifies all that. And he points out that the Union Army only went to 36% of Southern counties. And only in those counties, only 66% of the railroads were destroyed. And that doesn't count all the railroads outside of the Union Army counties. Only 5% of courthouses are burned. In other words, the destructiveness of the Army is vastly overrated on the Southern landscape. The exception of that are a couple of things. One is, if you look at what's really destroyed, it's farm implements and farm animals. But Paul has shown that the difference in that destructiveness between Union Army counties and non-Union Army counties is not significant. In other words, that's just the war itself. And the most important devastating aspect of the war for the economy is not really the war, but the South's initial dependence on slavery. It is the loss of all the capital invested in slavery when the war's over. Now, if you're an African American or anybody with a moral conscience, that's liberation, not loss. But again, that's where the economic, so it's really the aftermath of slavery that's so difficult on the Southern economy, not the destruction of the war. One other thing that's important, really important for understanding American history, happens in that economy. And that's what happens to the enslaved. You free 4 million enslaved people. They made a case, and they made a really eloquent case. And they said, we're owed 200 years of back labor, 200 years of back wages. We built the American economy. We remain loyal to the nation. And we helped win the war. So we deserve land. Why give land back to traitors who tried to destroy the Union rather than to the people who helped save it and who helped build it? And they demanded land. And except for a few exceptions, the North won't go along with it. It violates their conception of private property. They're not that committed to racial equality. So what you have is 4 million African Americans coming out of slavery with no resources in American society. Inherited wealth, accumulated wealth is so important generation after generation. The decision not to redistribute land after the Civil War is so important. The amazing thing is that African Americans, despite all that, still made progress. By 1900, land ownership had gone up among blacks from almost nothing to 20%. Literacy had gone up from 5% to 50%. So you do have black progress after the war. So why is the Southern economy in such a mess? It's because you come up with a solution. Blacks wanted land. If they couldn't get that, they wanted independence. White landowners still want to control the land. And so sharecropping and tenantry is the solution to that problem. It starts out as a compromise, but it gets worse and becomes a controlled form of labor. More importantly, the South commits to the reestablishment of the cotton economy. By 1879, the South grew more cotton than it had in 1859. It had expanded into the upcountry, but it was built on the exploitation of labor, in this case, sharecroppers and tenant farmers. But history plays a dirty trick in that with that commitment to the cotton culture, you have over time a dramatic drop in the price of cotton internationally. So it's this commitment to the cotton economy that shapes Southern poverty. So that by the 1930s, blacks are still a higher percentage of sharecroppers, but there are more white sharecroppers than there are black sharecroppers. And per capita income in most of the South by the 1930s is half the national income. And so the South, as Penn called it in The Great Alibi, says, oh, we're poor because of the war. The South's poor because of the decisions it makes after the war, the white South makes after the war. But it's poor in a special way. It's poor in a way that allows some people to get very rich, most of them the sons of the old planters, so that you create a Southern economy that's highly structured with white wealth and black poverty, but a lot of white poverty as well. You create a society that cares very little about developing its human capital because all you want them to do is work your land. So that much of what we still see plaguing Southern society is not a result of defeat in the Civil War. It's the decisions the white South makes in the wake of the war. Okay, I'm way out of time, so I'll stop. Can y'all unmute and talk? I apologize about my slides. I don't have y'all muted, so if you got questions, I'll answer them, but I've gone too long. I apologize for that. And I still didn't finish. All that stuff about criminality I mentioned, I'll get to that next week.
Comment just briefly, if you will, about the claim that states' rights were essential to slavery. And as a legal matter, not, I mean, you're large, you know, how that two things interwork.
Yeah, I don't see that, because even most Northern Republicans, not everybody. I mean, you've got the abolitionists, and you've got a growing number of people who want the war to be about slavery. More, I think, than I realize. Not as many as some historians want to claim these days. But the vast majority of Northerners would argue that, you know, that the Constitution, even without states' rights, the Constitution guarantees the right of slavery to exist where it is. And there's not a tremendous debate about that. I mean, so I don't see, you don't need to make an argument for states' rights to defend that. It's in the Constitution as it is.
Well, I was thinking of the observation that slavery depends on statute law, which is state law, for its actual existence.
Okay, yeah, well, that would be one way to make the argument.
Well,
but
it's part of the argument for states' rights that,
yeah.
that you know, bandied about.
Yeah, I've never done it, but it seems to me what's going on in 60 and 61 is they're not really talking about states' rights. They're talking about state sovereignty and independence. Yeah. And that's even different. Where to frame it as states' rights after, I mean, one of the reasons they want to make it states' rights after the war is they want to protect themselves from federal intervention on race that we'll talk about next time. Just to set the record straight, somebody asked me the other day about the murder of George Floyd. We ain't getting anywhere close to George Floyd, even with an extra week. So, but that would take me to the north, which I know least about. So I'm feeling you're probably better off. Other questions? Thank you, Paul. That's a good point. Oh, wow.
Gaines, I appreciate your observation about Nottoway slave labor plantation.
Slave labor camp.
Slave labor camp, sorry, yeah, because it's a useful, it brings people up short if you describe a plantation that way. So.
Okay, we will end the meeting. And I apologize again about the slides. I know you'll go through life really regretting having not seen all those hangings.